are moments in life when something feels wrong before you even realize why. I had that feeling the moment I pulled up to the house. The Craigslist ad had seemed normal, just another seller offloading an old Casio keyboard for cheap. But as I parked under the dim orange glow of a broken streetlight, staring at the darkened windows of the house, a deep unease settled in my chest. Something was off. Something was waiting for me. I had been searching for a cheap keyboard, nothing fancy, just a beater I could use for rough songwriting without worrying about spills or scratches. Craigslist seemed like the best place to find one. A few days earlier, I had already been burned once by a pawn shop scam. A seller promised me a Casio WK6600 at a steal, only for me to drive an hour round trip and find out it had been sold weeks before. Classic bait and switch. I was still pissed off about that. This time, I was determined to deal with a private seller. No stores, no games. That is when I found the Casio Tonebank CT650 listed for just $15. The ad screamed in all caps, "Working perfectly." The seller, a woman named Julie, confirmed she was home and ready for the sale. Her house was 20 miles away. Not too bad. I was just relieved to finally get what I wanted without the hassle. As I drove, the neighborhood grew increasingly empty. The houses here were old, their paint peeling. Some windows boarded up. No kids played outside. No lights flickered from inside the homes. It was the kind of place that made you double-check your car doors were locked. My gut told me to turn around, but I had already come this far. Then, just as I was about to pull onto Julie Street, my phone buzzed. OMG, I just plugged it in and it made a spark, and now it won't turn on. I stared at the message, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel. What? That was odd. Why would she test it at the last minute? And why even bother telling me? Most sellers would just say, "Sorry, it is not available anymore." Annoyed, I messaged back, "I fix electronics. I can still take it off your hands for $5. No sense wasting the trip. Maybe I could repair it." She responded immediately, "No, my husband is electrician. He will fix. I text you if he do." I exhaled sharply, my frustration boiling over. Why even list something for sale if you are going to back out at the last second? I shook my head, made a U-turn, and headed back home. Craigslist was a joke. But then, the next morning, I woke up to a new message from Julie. He fixed. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, just those two words. Something about it felt wrong, but I ignored the uneasy feeling and replied, "Still selling it?" No answer. By the evening, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I texted again, "If it is working, I can pick it up tonight." This time she responded instantly, "Come now 8 p.m., same address. I did not know why, but my hands felt cold as I typed, "On my way." The drive felt longer this time, the roads darker, the silence heavier. The closer I got, the more my stomach churned with something I could not name. Dread? No, that was ridiculous. It was just an old keyboard, a stupid $15 Craigslist deal. Yet, when I pulled up to the house, a deep chill settled in my bones. The porch light was off. The windows were dark. The street was utterly silent. No TV glow, no movement inside. Was anyone even home? I hesitated before stepping out of the car. My headlights barely cut through the thick shadows stretching across the cracked pavement. I checked the messages. Yes, this was the address. Then, from the darkness of the porch, a figure emerged. A man. He was tall and thin, his face hidden in the shadows, his clothes hanging off him as if they belonged to someone else. He was holding something in his hands, the keyboard. But the moment I saw it, every inch of my skin crawled with unease. It looked wrong, like it had been burned. The plastic casing was warped, discolored, almost melted. The keys were twisted, some pressed down permanently, as if they had been exposed to extreme heat. The air smelled faintly of something acrid, electrical fire. I swallowed hard. "Julie," my voice barely carried. The man did not respond. "Are you Julie's husband?" No answer. He stepped forward, holding the keyboard out as if offering it to me. My hands refused to move. Something inside me screamed, "Do not take it." Then, in the dim glow of my headlights, I saw his hands. His fingers were burned, the skin blackened, peeling, revealing raw flesh beneath, like he had grabbed something scalding hot with bare hands. My breath hitched. This was wrong. I forced a step back. "I changed my mind," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Keep it." He still said nothing, just stood there, holding the melted, ruined keyboard in those burned hands. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over myself, fumbling for my car door. I could feel him watching me as I scrambled inside and slammed the lock down. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the porch for just a second longer. The door behind him was open now, wide open, and inside, past the threshold, I could barely make out something standing in the darkness, tall, motionless, waiting. I tore out of that neighborhood without looking back. I blocked Julie's number, deleted the Craigslist ad. I told myself it was just a scam, just some creep trying to offload a busted keyboard. But deep down, I knew something else had happened there, something I had narrowly escaped. And the worst part, I checked Craigslist the next day just to see. The same Casio Tone Bank CT650 was listed again. Same photos, same description. Working perfectly. No seller name, no phone number. Just the words, "Come now, 8 p.m. There are some things you are better off leaving alone." Story 2. I have always believed that the worst kind of fear is the one that sneaks up on you, the kind you do not even recognize until you are already in the middle of it. That is what happened to me. And to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had made even the slightest wrong move. I was selling an old Korg KS4 synthesizer, not for much, just enough to make space in my small apartment. The ad had been up for months, mostly ignored, until one night a buyer finally messaged me. He was willing to drive 45 minutes to pick it up, but he wanted to come late, later than I was comfortable with. 9:30 p.m. Everything in me said, reschedule. But I needed the money, and after all, I had sold things on Craigslist before, without issue. So I agreed. When the knock came, I hesitated before opening the door. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the silence that settled in my apartment like a held breath. But when I finally turned the handle, I knew immediately I had made a mistake. There were two of them. The first man, the one who had messaged me, was grinning, not the polite, friendly kind of smile. Something else. His teeth were bared, stretched too wide, his eyes unfocused and darting. His hair was matted, his shirt damp with sweat. He reeked of booze and stale cigarettes. The second man was different, calmer, quieter, watchful. His posture was loose, but there was something in the way he scanned the room that made me uneasy, like he was checking for exits. And then I saw it. The first man's hand was wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, but the blood had soaked through, dark and wet, still dripping. I wanted to ask what happened. I wanted to tell them I had changed my mind. But before I could say anything, the grinning man pushed past me, heading straight for the keyboard. He sat down, and without a word, he started playing. Only he did not know how. His fingers smashed against the keys, creating a jarring, tuneless noise that sent a spike of unease through my chest. He was not testing the synth. He was just hitting random notes. The other man leaned against the doorframe, watching. My apartment was small, too small. My wife was just a few feet away, in our bedroom with the door shut. If something went wrong, there was no way she would hear it over the awful, pounding noise from the keyboard. I needed them to leave. "That is the volume knob," I said, forcing my voice to stay light, conversational. "Keep it normal." Keep it moving. You can adjust the tone here. The man did not respond. He just kept playing, hunched over, his bandaged hand leaving smears of blood on the keys. I shot a glance at the quieter man, hoping for some kind of explanation. He just shrugged, like this was normal. That is when I realized something was seriously wrong. The grinning man had not spoken once, not a single word. He grunted, muttered half-formed phrases under his breath, but he never actually spoke to me. He only kept watching, not just looking, watching, like he was waiting for something. I swallowed hard, shifting my weight toward the front door. I needed to end this, fast. "So, what do you think?" I asked, hoping he would just take the keyboard and go. He stopped. For the first time, he turned his head fully toward me, and then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. Every nerve in my body went rigid. I had no doubt what was about to happen. I was alone with two men I did not know. One of them was bleeding. The other was silent. My wife was behind a thin wooden door, oblivious. I could see it playing out in my mind. The flash of a blade, the sharp shock of pain, the second man stepping in to block the exit. I braced myself, and then he pulled out a crumpled wad of cash. My breath left me in a quiet, shaking exhale. The man placed the exact amount on the table, stood up without a word, and walked toward the door. His friend followed, still watching me, still saying nothing. The moment they stepped outside, I slammed the door and locked it. I stood there for a long time, listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. My body was buzzing with leftover adrenaline, my hands slick with sweat. I wanted to believe it was over, that it was just a weird interaction, but as I turned back to the keyboard, my stomach lurched. The blood was still there, dark red streaks across the white keys, a grotesque signature. I grabbed a rag to wipe it off, but the second my fingers touched the keys, I felt it, warm. The blood was still warm. I dropped the rag, staring at the door. I had locked it. Had I heard it click? The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, the air too still. And then, somewhere outside, the same jarring, tuneless notes echoed through the hallway, a perfect replica of the awful sound the man had made. My heart stuttered. I had the keyboard, but they were still playing it. Story 3. Some things are better left forgotten. Some things should have stayed in the ashes. I have always been into vintage synthesizers, Old Moogs, Junos, dusty relics from forgotten bands, and Craigslist was a gold mine back in the day. In Las Vegas, between 2006 and 2011, you could buy entire 70s and 80s setups for next to nothing. I met a lot of weird people, dug through abandoned houses, and made deals with musicians who had not touched their gear in decades. But there is one Craigslist deal I will never forget. It started with a listing: guitar shop liquidation sale. Everything must go. Not exactly what I was looking for, but the photos caught my eye. Among the amps, cables, and half-broken Stratocasters, something was there, barely visible in the background. A Moog Voyager. Anyone who knew synthesizers would tell you that was not something you just tossed on the floor like a cheap Casio. And yet, there it was, lying on its side, half buried in cables. I had to see it for myself. I messaged the seller and convinced them to let me stop by before the open house. The place was a hole-in-the-wall shop near the outskirts of Vegas, tucked between a boarded-up laundromat and a liquor store with neon signs flickering on their last breath. The building itself was scarred, blackened streaks along the roof, soot-stained windows. When I stepped inside, the air still carried the faint, acrid stench of smoke. The owner, a grizzled man in his late 50s, waved me over. "You the synth guy?" His voice was raspy, like someone who had spent a lifetime breathing in sawdust and cigarette smoke. I nodded. "You really have a Moog Voyager?" He shrugged. "If you can fix it, it is yours." He led me to the back, past half-disassembled guitars and forgotten equipment piled like junkyard scrap. And then I saw it. The Moog. It looked wrong. The body was charred, streaked with black soot. The keys were warped, slightly melted. The knobs were covered in some kind of grayish-white dust. Ash. I ran my fingers along the surface. It felt cold, not like plastic, like stone. The owner crossed his arms. "Was in a house fire," he muttered. "Survived somehow." Something about that phrase sent a ripple of unease through me. Survived somehow. I knelt down, plugging it into a nearby power strip. The Moog's LED screen flickered weakly to life, but the patch names were garbled nonsense. It was alive, but not quite right. I should have walked away, but I did not. I bought it for $400. It felt like a steal. That night, back in my apartment, I started cleaning it. The soot came off in thick layers, like it had been burned more than once. As I worked, the room felt heavier, colder. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then I turned it on. At first, there was nothing, just a faint hum like it was struggling to wake up. I hooked it up to my MIDI controller, sent a factory reset, and slowly it came back to life. And then it started playing on its own, a single note, low, rumbling, wrong. I checked the sequencer. It was empty. Another note joined, then another, a slow, creeping melody. Something about it unsettled me. It was not just random noise. It felt deliberate, like something was remembering. I stepped back, my hands suddenly cold. The smell of smoke filled the room, not from the synth, from everywhere. I turned around, expecting what? A fire? Someone standing behind me? Nothing. I turned back, and the mood had changed. The screen was scrambled again, but this time the text made sense. Hello? I froze. The screen flickered. Where am I? My breath caught in my throat. I yanked the power cord. The room fell silent, but the smell of burning wood still lingered. I did not sleep that night. The Moog stayed in the corner, dark and silent, but I swore I could still hear something. A low, humming note. Waiting. The next morning, I did the only thing I could think of. I put it back on Craigslist. Story 4. There are moments in life when something does not feel right, but you go through with it anyway. You convince yourself you are just being paranoid. You tell yourself it is just another Craigslist deal, another random buyer trying to haggle down the price. But sometimes you should trust your instincts. I had put up an ad for a Roland VK7 clone wheel organ I was selling. It had been with me for a few years, and before that, it had belonged to an older musician, one of those guys who had lived through the golden age of music, a piece of history passed from one set of hands to another. The buyer had reached out a week earlier, seemed genuinely interested. He agreed on the price, and I held it for him like a fool. Then, the night before we met, he started nitpicking. Suddenly, the bumps and scratches in the pictures were a big deal. Suddenly, he wanted a discount. Fine, $50 off, just to get it over with. We met in the Guitar Center parking lot just after sunset. I had the VK7 in a hard case in my trunk, ready to go. He pulled up in an old, beat-up sedan, the kind that looked like it had survived more than a few accidents. When he stepped out, something felt off immediately. He was tall and thin, his clothes hanging off him in a way that made me wonder if he had lost weight recently. His eyes darted around, never quite settling on me. And then there was his smile, too wide, too forced, like he was trying to convince me he was harmless. I popped the trunk, showed him the keyboard. He ran his fingers over it, like he was inspecting a crime scene. These scratches, pretty bad, he muttered. Hailed slowly. You saw the pictures? He hummed, lowballing me by $100. $150. Shook my head. Not happening. Another pause. His fingers twitched. Then he grinned. Fine. 50 off. I nodded, ready to get this over with. He asked for the keys. No, I said, a little too quickly. It is not for sale. He did not like that. I could see it in his posture, the way he rocked back on his heels, staring at me just a little too long. 40 for the case. It is not for sale. Another pause. He smiled again, but this time there was something wrong behind his eyes, like he was trying to figure something out. Then, as if nothing had happened, he shrugged. I will grab the cash. He walked away, disappearing behind a few parked cars. For a moment, I considered getting in my car and leaving. Then he came back with 2 trumpet cases. I tensed. What was in those cases? He handed me the money. Then, out of nowhere, you want to watch me play 2 trumpets at once? I hesitated. What? His grin widened. It is a talent. Before I could say anything, he dropped to the ground, popped open the cases, and pulled out 2 battered trumpets. Then he started playing, loud. The sound blasted through the parking lot, a shrieking, discordant mess that made my skin crawl. It was not music, it was noise, and he kept going. For 15 minutes, I stood there, frozen, gripping the cash in my hand, wondering what the hell was happening. And then, as suddenly as he started, he stopped. He looked up at me, eyes gleaming in the dim light. What do you think? I forced a nod. Impressive. He did not blink. Wanna hear another? No, I said, stepping back. I should go. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he laughed. Okay, but next time, you should really hear the whole thing. I did not reply. I just got in my car, shut the door, and drove off, watching him in my rear view mirror. He stood there, still smiling, still watching. That would have been the weirdest Craigslist deal of my life. But a few months later, I met someone even stranger. I had driven 4 hours to pick up a Korg Poly 61 from an old collector. The listing said it was in pieces, but complete. That was fine. I could fix it. When I arrived, the seller led me into his warehouse. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. There were rows of old instruments, stacked like bodies. Hammonds, Moogs, Prophets, hundreds. Some of them were perfectly preserved, others were not. What do you think? The man asked. I turned, taking him in for the first time. He was old, but not frail. His hands were too clean for someone who spent their life fixing equipment. I have more in the back, he said. I followed him deeper. The air grew stale, suffocating. I glanced up. On the highest shelves, far above my head, were organs from the 1940s, stacked 3 stories high. There was no ladder. "How do you get those down?" I asked. He did not answer. He just smiled. Story 5. There is a moment when you realize you have made a mistake. A moment when your brain catches up to what your gut has been screaming all along. I felt that moment the second I heard the garage door slam shut behind me. But by then, it was too late. It all started with an ad. A Sano 500er vintage tube amp priced ridiculously low, way below what it should have been worth. It looked pristine in the photos, almost too good to be true. I should have known then. The seller had been strange from the start. After a few emails, we agreed on a time to meet, but he refused to give me an address. Instead, he told me to call him once I reached his town. Weird, but okay. When I arrived, I dialed the number. He picked up, but immediately told me to call him back on a different number. Once I got closer to the house, he claimed his phone was almost out of minutes. I remember gripping the wheel a little tighter, my gut stirring with something I could not place. A burner phone, not a great sign, but I had come this far. The drive led me into the woods, down a gravel road by a river. No neighbors, no streetlights, just endless trees pressing in from all sides, swallowing what little daylight was left. I almost turned around. I wish I had. I pulled into the driveway of a rundown house, barely more than a shack. The garage was open, and a man stood inside watching me. He was smoking a cigarette, his face hidden beneath a low-pulled cap and a hood drawn tightly over it. Even from the car, I could see that something was off. His stance was too still, too calculated. But I told myself, just stay outside. Just check the amp. What could go wrong? I got out, moving slowly. The second I stepped inside the garage, he pulled the door down behind me. No words, no hesitation, just slam. A trap. My stomach tightened as I spun, staring at the now closed garage door. I still had not seen his face. My mind was racing, searching for an out. I was alone. My car was outside, but I was boxed in. I could not see inside the house, but the door leading into it was slightly open. The man took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. Then, without a word, he dragged something heavy out from the shadows. The amp. I forced myself to breathe, keep it normal, keep it moving. It was in horrible shape. The photos had lied badly. The Tolex was ripped and re-glued in jagged strips. Someone had tried to spray paint it gold, but the paint had dripped, streaking down the sides. There were holes drilled into the chassis, random patches of duct tape, burn marks. The thing looked like it had been tortured. He still had not spoken. I was stuck. If I rejected the amp, I would have cash in my pocket and no escape route. He was hovering behind me now, close enough that I could smell him. Sweat, cigarettes, something else. His breathing was uneven, raspy. The air in the garage felt thick, suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke. "You like it?" His voice was too soft. I forced myself to nod, running my fingers over the warped casing. "Yeah, looks good." Lie. "Want to test it?" he asked. No. He bent down, plugging it in. The moment the power surged through it, the amp came alive, and it sounded perfect. I barely heard it over the blood pounding in my ears, over the screaming in my head telling me to get out. He was too close now. I needed to end this. I forced a smile. "I'll take it." His fingers twitched. For a second, I thought he would stop me. Then he exhaled. "Cool." I handed him the money. He took it without counting. I lifted the amp, moving toward the garage door. He hesitated. For a split second, I thought he would block the exit. Instead, he reached past me, unlocked it, and pushed it open. I walked out without looking back. I barely breathed until I was on the highway. The whole way home, my hands stayed clamped around the wheel, white-knuckled. I had escaped. But the amp, when I got home, I wiped it down, trying to clean off the grime. I checked the chassis again, and that was when I noticed it. Something carved into the metal. "Help me." I ran my fingers over the scratches, my chest tightening. The words had been dug in deep, desperate. Not a prank, not a joke. I looked at the amp, still plugged in, still humming softly, and suddenly it did not seem like such a good deal anymore. Story 6. Some people say every second-hand item has a story, but some stories should stay buried. I have been buying and selling music gear for years. Craigslist, eBay, pawn shops. I have seen it all. Some deals are great. Others come with something you cannot return. I learned that the hard way. It started with an ad for power amps and PA equipment. I drove out to a guy's place, expecting a quick buy and go. Nothing weird, nothing sketchy. Then I saw it. Buried in a Tupperware container filled with old cables and dusty microphones was something special, a Space Echo RE201. If you know, you know. These things are legendary. I asked him about it, and he sighed. "Pain in the ass to maintain," he muttered. That should have been my first warning. He told me he had moved on to newer rack gear and did not need it anymore. I asked if he wanted to sell, and after a brief pause, he shrugged. "Sure, $100. A steal." I did not question it. I should have. I took it home, ordered a new reel of tape, and within a few days, I had a perfectly functioning space echo. At first, it worked fine, but then, at night, it would turn itself on. I thought maybe I had left it plugged in. Maybe it had a power issue, but it kept happening. Even when it was unplugged, a few months later, I met the kid. I had been selling a couple of guitar pedals online, just clearing out gear. He showed up at my place, looked around, and spotted my synth setup. "You into vintage stuff?" he asked. I nodded. His eyes lit up. "You should check out something we got at the pawn shop," he said. I was skeptical. Most pawn shops had been picked clean thanks to eBay pricing, but he insisted. The next day I stopped by. He brought out a Korg Poly 6. It was damaged. The keybed was busted, and the only sound it made was a low, rumbling drone. I popped it open. Battery acid damage. Classic problem. Not surprising. But something else felt wrong. The moment I touched it, the drone changed. Not just noise. Something that almost sounded like a voice. The kid stared at me. "That is new," he whispered. I traded him a pedal for it, took it straight to a former Korg tech in the next town over. He fixed everything except for one sticky key. Even had a tape with the original factory patches, one of my favorite synths to this day. But sometimes, when I play it, I hear the drone again, and it sounds like words. But that is not the worst part. One night, I was working late, messing with some delay effects. The room was dimly lit, just me and my synths. I powered up the space echo, and the instant the tape started rolling, something else played. Not my sound, a recording, a voice. It was low, distorted, layered under the feedback. "Do you hear me?" I recoiled. The tape reel spun faster. Another voice, whispering, "Where am I?" The words warped, stretching into static before the echo repeated itself, looping endlessly. "Do you hear me? Where am I?" The knobs started turning on their own. The delay time stretched, slowing down the voice, making it deeper, hollow. I lunged for the power switch. The tape kept playing. "You should not have taken it." My hands shook. I yanked the power cord. The room fell silent. I stared at the space echo, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The tape reel was still spinning. I unplugged it for good. I put the space echo back on Craigslist the next day. I never checked to see who bought it, but sometimes, when I am alone in my studio, surrounded by gear I know too well, I hear it. A low drone, like something is waiting. Story 7. Okay, here's the Craigslist seller who would not let me leave, in 7 paragraphs, with the headings removed. There is a point where politeness becomes a trap. A moment when your instincts scream for you to leave, but you smile instead, nodding along, waiting for the right moment to slip away. I should have walked out after the first 10 minutes, but I stayed. And that is how I almost got trapped in a stranger's house with no easy way out. It started with a simple Craigslist listing, a vintage synthesizer, decently priced, nothing too rare, but worth checking out. The seller seemed normal enough over email. He even said, "Feel free to just come look, no pressure to buy." That was a lie. When I arrived, his house was smaller than I expected, tucked into a quiet, almost lifeless neighborhood. The sky had started turning gray, the kind of dull, heavy light that makes everything feel just a little bit off. I knocked on the door. It swung open immediately. The man on the other side was thin, disheveled, eyes darting back and forth as if checking for something behind me. His lips curled into a half smile, but there was something wrong with it, something too eager. "Come in," he said. Not a question. I hesitated. Never go inside. That was my rule. Always check the gear in the doorway, the garage, the driveway, anywhere but inside. But the synth required an external setup, some kind of convoluted process to make it work. "Gotta plug it in," he insisted, gesturing for me to step in. I made my second mistake. The room was cluttered, filled with half-broken equipment, stacks of old manuals, cables, coiled in tangled knots. It smelled like dust and something stale, like food left out too long. He set up the synth, talking fast, rambling about settings, about old gigs he claimed to have played. The whole time he kept glancing at me, watching. I did a brief test. It worked, but it was not for me. "Yeah, I think I will pass," I said, keeping my voice light. "But thanks for letting me check it out." That was when he snapped. His entire body got tensed, his face twisting into something ugly. "What do you mean, pass?" I took a step back. "I just do not think it is what I am looking for." His nostrils flared. "Nobody wants it." His voice rose, anger creeping into the edges. "You wasted my time." I held up my hands, trying to keep the situation calm. "Look, I really appreciate it. Someone else will buy it, I am sure." "Someone else?" He laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "You think there will be someone else?" I glanced toward the door, and he stepped in front of it. I swallowed hard, keeping my face neutral. "Listen, I actually have to be somewhere soon, so His expression changed again, shifting into something eerily calm. "Maybe you will like something else." Before I could respond, he turned away and started rummaging through his pile of gear. "I have other stuff, real vintage, not like this piece of junk." I took another step toward the door. "I really do have to. Just let me show you." He grabbed a mixer, launching into another monologue. 5 minutes turned into 10, then 20. Every time I hinted at leaving, he would suddenly find something else to show me. My heart was beating faster now. 2 hours. That was how long he kept me there. I had stopped listening. I was just waiting for an opening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowed down, his voice trailing off into a mumble, his eyes unfocused, like whatever spell had possessed him was starting to wear off. I seized my chance. I laughed. You know, you are a real expert. I learned a lot. Thanks for showing me everything. He blinked, as if coming out of a daze. His lips moved, but no words came out. I grabbed my bag, kept my steps steady, calm, and reached for the door handle. And then his hand twitched. For a split second, I thought he was going to stop me. But then he just sighed. I opened the door, stepped outside, and walked. Not too fast, not too slow, just normal. But the second I reached my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the doorway, still watching. That should have been the end, but a week later, I saw his listing again. Same synth, same description, but now it read, "Serious buyers only. Do not waste my time." And the worst part, underneath, in small print, was something new. Already had one visitor, might not need another. I never reported it. I never called the police, but I never forgot. Because deep down, I knew I had barely gotten out. Story 8. There is a certain unease that comes with meeting a stranger in an empty parking lot at night. You tell yourself it is fine, that you will be in and out in minutes. But then, as you stand under the dim glow of a dying streetlight, you start to feel it, the weight of the silence, the sensation that someone might be watching. That is how it started. A few years ago, I was selling 2 beach house tickets through Craigslist. The buyer seemed young, maybe college-aged. We agreed to meet in a supermarket parking lot, a public place, safe, or so I thought. By the time he arrived, the supermarket was closed. The lot was empty, dark. The neon signs flickered weakly, buzzing in the distance. He pulled up in an old sedan, headlights cutting through the darkness. I could see the hesitation in his face, the way his eyes darted around. How do we do this?" he asked, voice tight with nervous energy. I laughed, just a little. It was an easy transaction. I showed him the tickets. He handed over the money. Simple. But for some reason, he kept standing there, not leaving, just watching me. I felt something shift in the air, a moment too long, a silence that did not belong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he mumbled a thanks, got back into his car, and sped off. I stood there for a few seconds, my hands clenched at my sides, my breath slow and measured. Then I realized he had not stopped at the exit. His car was still idling at the edge of the lot, watching. I got in my car and left without looking back. That should have been the end of it. But then, years later, I encountered something much worse. I was selling a JX3P synthesizer, listing it on Craigslist. Nothing unusual, just another sale. Then, one night, I stumbled upon a reverb listing for the same synth, except the seller had used my photos, my exact photos. He was trying to sell a synthesizer he did not even own. I clicked into his store, feeling a slow, creeping sense of unease. He had multiple listings, and nearly all of them had photos taken from local Craigslist ads, including mine. Who was he? I checked his seller profile. No real name, no location, just a string of generic responses to past buyers. I messaged him. No reply. Then, the next day, my Craigslist ad was deleted. Not by me. It was gone. I tried to relist it. Blocked. A deep unease settled in my gut. This was not just a scammer flipping synths. This was something else. I reported him to Reverb's management. They responded quickly, took his store down. But then, a few days later, a new listing appeared. Different name, same photos. And the worst part, the seller had changed. It now read, people should be careful of what they sell. I checked my Craigslist account. It had been compromised. The password did not work anymore. I was locked out. I sat there in the dim glow of my laptop, my skin crawling, my mind racing. I had always thought of Craigslist horror stories as something that happened to other people, not to me. But now, somewhere out there, someone knew my listings, knew what I sold, knew me. Story 9. People always assume that the scariest Craigslist stories involve dark alleys, shady buyers, or sellers who vanish the moment money changes hands. But sometimes the real danger is not the deal itself. It is the place you never should have stepped into. When I was 19, I was looking for a room to rent near my college, about an hour from home. My mom was helping me search, and after weeks of dead ends, she found a Craigslist listing, a room for $300 a month, all utilities included. The homeowner was a middle-aged man who lived in a finished basement, renting the upstairs rooms to women. The listing made it clear he rarely interacted with his tenants, had his own kitchen and entrance, and only rented to women because of past bad experiences with male roommates. It sounded reasonable, cheap, quiet, safe. But some deals are too good to be true. We arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. The house itself was ordinary. Clean lawn, a normal front porch, nothing that screamed danger. The man opened the door, smiling warmly. I should have felt relieved. Instead, something about his smile felt off. He welcomed us inside. The living room was tidy, the kitchen spotless. My mom struck up a conversation with him, asking about the house, the area, small talk. She was always friendly, always the type to trust too easily. I stayed quiet, watching. And then he said, "Let me show you your room." I turned toward the staircase leading upstairs, but instead he opened a different door. A door leading down. We followed him into the basement. The air was stale, thick with something I could not place. The only light came from a small, flickering bulb. He led us to a tiny room with no windows, no closet, nothing but a single bed pushed against the far wall. "You will be staying here," he said. I froze. "Wait," I said. "I thought the rooms were upstairs." He waved a hand dismissively. "You will be more comfortable down here. Less noise, more privacy." Then he added, "You will share the bathroom with me." His bedroom, if you could call it that, was across the hall. No door. Just a mattress shoved into a dark corner. I turned to my mom, waiting for her to see what I was seeing, but she was still smiling, nodding along, listening to his every word. I wanted to scream. Then, as if sensing my unease, he said, "Let us go upstairs." We followed him back up. He led us to the rooms that were supposedly rented out. The doors were wide open. I took a step inside. The beds were perfectly made, but there were no signs of life. No clothes, no bags, no shoes by the door, only men's clothes in one of the closets. He let me wander. He watched. Then I heard him tell my mom, "I keep some of my things in their closets. They do not mind." I felt sick. Why would any tenant pay for a room only to have their landlord using it for storage? And why did it feel like no one else had ever lived here? I started guiding my mom back downstairs. I needed to get out. That was when he mentioned it. "You should come back next week. Have dinner with me and the other tenants." My mom smiled. "That is a great idea." He nodded. "Your parents will be out of town, right?" I went still. We had mentioned that in passing conversation when we first arrived, but the way he repeated it now, like a reminder, like a confirmation, made my skin crawl. I forced a tight smile. "Sure." And then we left. The second we got into the car, I turned to my mom. "I am not living there." She looked shocked. "What?" He was so nice. I could hardly get the words out fast enough. He lied about the room. He expected me to sleep in a basement with no windows, no closet, sharing a bathroom with him, and his room did not even have a door. She hesitated. "Well, I guess that is a little weird." I cut her off. Did you notice that no one else even lived there? That there were no signs of other tenants? He is making up stories about women who are not real. He wanted me alone in that house. She still looked unconvinced. I had to call my stepdad, get him to explain it before she finally understood. That night, I tried to report the listing, but by the time we got home, it was gone. For years, I convinced myself that maybe it was just a weird situation. Maybe he was just an odd guy. But then I read something. A law enforcement officer commented on a similar case. This sounds like a trafficking setup. The windowless basement room, the false tenants, the insistence on getting me alone. I felt a cold certainty settle in my gut. If I had gone back for dinner, I would not have left. I think about that sometimes, about how easy it is to ignore warning signs, about how my mom thought he was just being nice, but I saw it, and I got out. Story 10. There is something unnerving about a deal that seems too good to be true. At first, you try to justify it. Maybe the person is just generous. Maybe they need the money fast. But deep down, a voice in the back of your mind whispers, "It is a trap." I wish I had listened sooner. My boyfriend and I were desperate to save money. We had been looking for a place for weeks when he found an ad on Craigslist. A room for $300 a month in a nice neighborhood. We expected a rundown area, maybe something sketchy. Instead, when we arrived, the street was pristine, manicured lawns, quiet homes, the kind of place that felt too perfect. We sent a text to the landlord saying we were outside. A few seconds later, the front door opened. A man stepped out. He waved once and then shut the door. My boyfriend and I stared at each other. "What was that?" he muttered. I shrugged. Maybe he did not realize we needed to come inside. So we called him. He answered immediately and told us to come in. The house was immaculate, almost too clean. He greeted us with a polite, empty smile. He seemed friendly enough, but something about his eyes felt off, cold. He mentioned that another tenant had just moved in hours ago. I nodded, but something about the house felt wrong. It was clean, yes, but it did not look lived in. There were no personal touches, no shoes by the door, no mail on the counter. The walls were bare, like a stage set. Then came the first red flag. "I used to be a police officer," he said, almost casually. My boyfriend stiffened. I could see it in his posture. He did not trust cops. Not like that. Not ones who brought it up unprompted. The man smiled again. "Come on, let me show you your room." We followed him upstairs. The hallway was empty, too quiet. He led us to a door, pushed it open. The room had no furniture, only a blow-up mattress and a lamp. Then came the second red flag. He turned to us and said, "By the way, the door does not lock." I frowned. "What?" He smiled like it was not a big deal, just in case something happens, and the police need to get to you quickly. I felt my boyfriend tense beside me. No lock in a house full of strangers? And then came the third red flag. "You will not have a key," he said. "If you need to get in, just knock." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. My boyfriend cleared his throat. "And you live here alone?" The man shook his head. "My sister stays here sometimes. She is also a cop." He smiled again. "She might come in while still in uniform. Do not be startled." I was done. My boyfriend and I exchanged a quick glance. "We need to talk about this," he said, forcing a grin. "Outside." The landlord did not argue. We stepped outside, letting the door click shut behind us. For a moment, we stood on the porch, silent. Then my boyfriend muttered, "Let's go." I turned back toward the house, and every light inside had been turned off. The windows were pitch black. I felt my breath catch in my throat. We walked fast to the car, got in, locked the doors. The house stayed dark. We drove away, hearts pounding, not saying a word. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a control freak. Maybe he was paranoid. But then I remembered something. The front door had no peephole, or rather, it had one, but it was covered. And the side windows next to the door, blackout curtains, nailed into place. I had not thought much about it at the time, but now I could not stop thinking about it. He had not wanted anyone looking inside. I told my boyfriend, and his face went pale. "That was not a rental," he muttered. "That was a trap." Later that night, I thought about something else. He had said he owned a restaurant and worked with celebrities. He had huge posters of famous people in his garage. But why the garage? Why not in the house? Like they were there for show. Like everything was there for show. We never called him back. I tried to report the listing, but by the time we checked, it had already been deleted, like it had never existed. I do not know what would have happened if we had stayed. Maybe nothing. Or maybe, after a few weeks, he would have started making rules. Maybe he would have gone through our things when we were gone. Maybe he would have started locking the front door from the outside.